Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first substantive lecture of the semester, the first mini lecture that we'll actually be talking about American politics and political science. So for today, we are going to be thinking about the first kind of set of principles of political analysis. And we're going to be thinking about rationality, and especially collective action and institutions, thinking about like what actually makes political science a science, or what makes political science distinct from just political commentary. So our goals today are to define and describe some of these concepts, and we're also going to describe the discipline of political science. So I'm going to start by kind of an overview of political science, and then think a bit more about collective action problems, which are really kind of some of the hallmarks of political science and what we study. And finally, from this discussion of collective action problems, thinking a little bit about what we mean when we call something political. So the first where I want to start here is, what is political science? What are we doing in this class, in this department, right? Are we giving policy advice here? As we can see, Secretary of Defense Mike Pompeo here. Is it political journalism? Is it as we can, a panel of political pundits providing commentary on current affairs? Is it how to win campaigns and elections? Is it laboratory science? Do we run experiments on people? Not really any of these, right? Political science is distinct from like the natural sciences in that we are dealing with people. So while political scientists surely do run experiments, they are very different than the natural sciences. But our goal as political scientists is not to report about current affairs and political affairs, or to give you advice on how to win elections, or to just provide commentary on the news. Our goal is a little bit different. As political scientists, we're trying to both understand and explain the political world. So we're looking at questions like, what factors influence and predict political behavior? How have political institutions changed over time? Why are political parties becoming more polarized? You can see this idea of prediction and influence, these how and these why questions, right? We're trying to explain something. We're not simply trying to describe the world or comment on the world. Political science isn't just where you get to blog about why the Republicans or the Democrats are wrong, or why this person should win the next election. So what political scientists do is develop concepts that help us analyze and understand the world. Concepts like polarization or collective action. We also develop methods for analyzing data information. How are we going to study the political world, since we can't study human beings in the same way that we would study chemistry or biology or other things in the natural sciences? And we develop theories that explain political phenomenon. And we can think of these theories in two different ways. We can think of them in our kind of traditional independent and dependent variable. What is the effect of some independent variable on some dependent variable? Like, what is the effect of education on voting behavior? What is the effect of income inequality on political institutions? These are all questions that we might ask. But we also might ask less causal questions, right? Less cause and effect questions, and more what political scientists would call constitutive. What factors explain the existence, development, or influence of political parties, or or of power, or of certain ideologies or political beliefs, where we might be asking a different set of questions. And in this class, and political scientists more generally, we're going to focus on five main principles, so that when we are trying to explain the political world, we're going to do so with reference to five key ideas. The first is the idea that people are rational, that people make decisions and act in ways that reflect their own interests and preferences. This is just an assumption. Obviously, people are not 100% rational all the time, but we assume that for the most part, most people act rationally. They don't just do things randomly, but when they behave in politics, they're trying to maximize their own benefits, right? They vote for candidates that they think are going to benefit themselves, their own values or interests, right? This counts for people, why it explains people's voting behavior. You can think of members of Congress acting rationally to pursue their own self-interest. However, individual rationality, even though individuals are acting in their own self-interest, that can create certain collective action problems, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the second principle is that we use institutions, both formal institutions like Congress and informal institutions, um, less formal institutions like political parties or even just norms of behavior to manage these collective action problems. The third kind of principle here is that our choices are constrained, that institutions, power, history, all these things mean that when we're making choices in politics, we're not choosing between our ideal options, but we're often choosing on what we could say is a constrained choice set. That we don't have infinite options, we don't have infinite time and infinite information, that we have to make a decision based on the best possible information, which is not perfect, or we have to make the kind of least bad option rather than the ideal option. The fourth principle is that power matters. Power, and we'll talk about this next week. What do I mean by power? But we can broadly think of power as the ability to influence others and influence outcomes most generally, and we'll complicate that definition next week. But power is both an input into the political process and an output, right? More powerful actors have more ability to influence political decision making, and the effects of political decisions, of laws, of policy changes, of administrative actions can redistribute power in a society. So power is both an input and an output. Finally, history matters. Actions in the past have consequences for action now. The way that institutions were designed in the late 19th century or 18th century impacts the type of political behavior and political actions that can happen now. And we'll talk about all of these throughout the semester and talk about these in our discussion section as well. So what is political science then? David Easton, in your reading for this week, talks about, he characterizes political science as the study of the way in which decisions for society are made and considered binding most of the time by most of the people. The goal is to understand political life, is to address oneself to the study of the authoritative allocation of valued things for a society. So we're studying how decisions get made that allocate valuable things for society, how a society determines what is valuable, and how those decisions of value come to be understood as binding. So we can think of political science as different than like economics or sociology, because this question of authority and decision making, right? It's not simply about the behavior of individuals or firms like in economics or in groups like in sociology, but that we're really interested in power and authority, authoritative decision making. Now, in this article, Easton then traces the development of political science into a variety of different stages and approaches. The first is the traditional stage. This goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Aristotle in an attempt to define different ways that political power could be organized and the particular virtues and vices of different political organizations, from democracy to aristocracy to monarchy. The goal here was to distinguish different political and institutional forms. Like what is a distinction between a democracy and an oligarchy, or a democracy and a republic? And in this stage, it was fairly theoretically and methodologically simple. There weren't overarching theories of politics. They weren't rigorous methods. There weren't data collection. The goal was to describe the political world, not necessarily and evaluate it. It was very normative, not explain it. But in the mid 20th century, we get this what is known as the behavioralist revolution, and the goal here was that political science and the social sciences more broadly should develop empirically testable theories that explain general uniformities in political behavior. Now, this approach rests on a series of assumptions. First is that there are discoverable uniformities in human behavior, that human beings, for the most part, under similar conditions, would act differently. And we're interested in what are those conditions and what differences would make people act differently. That we can confirm these uniformities by rigorous empirical tests of data. That the more methodologically rigorous, the more sound our methods, the more scientific, the more quantitative often our analysis is, the better it is. But the goal of science should be to generate empirically testable hypotheses or theories, right? Our goal of science is not to simply describe, but to have a theory that explains something that we can test against data. That social sciences should be positivistic, And this generally means that the goal of social science is to explain facts, not make value judgments, that we're not supposed to say which is the best regime or is democracy good or bad. We're simply trying to explain democracy. And finally, the goal of political science is what people would call a basic theory or basic research, not applied research. That the goal is not to advise policymakers or political campaigns, but to understand the nature of political phenomena. So this then gives way in the late 20th century, especially with the counterculture of the 60s, that showed the limits of uniform behavior to this, what we can call post-behavioralist, where the idea here is that human beings aren't these deterministic atoms like physics, that we can't use the kind of approaches of, we can't model social sciences based on the physical sciences. And that social sciences, because they involve human beings and real stakes, can never be truly value free. And so now we kind of have this idea of methodological and theoretical pluralism, that there are still behavioralists in political science, but we also have people who are more institutionalists. We have people who adopt more sociological approaches, people who study kind of group formation and how group identity can shape political behavior. There are more historically oriented social sciences who study the development of political institutions over time. So we have a much more broadly and capacious conception of political science. Now, one of the key hallmarks of political and the key kind of questions and theory concepts of political science is this idea of a collective action problem. And these are problems that arise when individuals would be better off cooperating or acting in a particular way, but fail to do so because they have conflicting interests. In your reading for this week, Mancur Olson talks about how rational, self-interested individuals will not achieve their common or group interests, even if all the individuals in a large group are rational and self-interest, and would gain if, as a group, they acted to achieve their common interest or objective. They will still not voluntarily act to achieve that common or group interest. That even though it would be in everyone's self-interest to act in a particular way, to cooperate, that rationally self-interested individuals won't do that. Now, why does this occur? And it really comes down to this idea of rationality, that because individuals are primarily self-interested, they're focusing on ways that maximize their own expected outcomes or best secure their own preferences or values. And they're not necessarily concerned about the group. So even if the group as a whole would be better off if everyone acted it in a certain way, as individuals, they might say that that's too costly, or I don't want to do that, or I might have a comparative advantage not cooperating. So if you've ever lived with roommates, you've probably encountered the collective action problem of the shared fridge, where there's just rotting food from who knows how long ago in the back of the fridge that no one wants to clean it up. Now, why is that? This is what's known as a collective action problem around public goods. Now, public goods are defined as non-rivalrous, and this means that using the good or the resource does not lessen the quantity or the quality of the good, but also non-excludable, that no one can be prevented from using the resources. Now, we can think of like a clean refrigerator as a public good, right? Like everyone benefits, right? And you can't exclude your roommates from using the fridge because it's a shared fridge. And you using the fridge, as long as there's still some room, does not lessen the quality or the quantity of the good. Now, in real life, there are very few actual public goods, but your textbook in the chapter that you're actually going to read next week talks about how that we can think of public goods as goods that are provided by the government that anyone can use and that are available to everyone without charge. So here the idea is like, right, you all share the fridge. You're not charging your roommates every time they put some leftovers in the fridge, right? But because of that, it creates incentives for what's known as free riding, right? Everyone would benefit from a cleaner fridge. However, I don't want to be the only person who does the act, pays the cost of time and grossness to clean up the fridge. So even though everyone would benefit, I don't want to be the sucker who does all the work. So I'm going to just assume that someone else will take care of it, and I'll still benefit because I'll still have access to the fridge as long as, that someone else cleans it up. So I'm going to free ride on those other people. Another way that we can think about collective action problems deals with a different kind of good, and these are common pool resources. And these are non-excludable, but they are rivalrous. And so these are goods that everyone has access to, but will be depleted as people use them. And the classic examples here are environmental goods, right? So clean water, or a forest for timber, or other natural resources, right? And the concern here is this creates incentives for overconsumption, right? If everyone has access to this forest to harvest for timber, but as we harvest for timber, it's going to use up the forest, I have an incentive as a rational individual who's concerned with my own well-being to harvest as much timber as I possibly can, sell that timber before other people use up that forest. Often this gets framed in terms of Garrett Hardin's famous article, The Tragedy of the Commons. And he says that this is the tragedy of the commons, why we can't have nice things, basically. That if we have these common pool resources, that this is going to create a tragedy of overconsumption, and that the only solution, according to Hardin, is like we basically need coercive force. He calls it mutually agreed upon, mutually bounding coercion. However, Garrett Hardin isn't a good guy. He writing about ecological problems he wrote a series of other articles in addition to Tragedy of the Commons that basically said that the world is becoming overpopulated and that we need to basically stop overpopulation by forcibly sterilizing the developing world. As the Southern Poverty Law Center says, he explicitly argued that government should adopt coercive measures to prevent women, especially, as he argued elsewhere, non-white women from reproducing. He's also wrote that certain racial groups have, quote, adopted overbreeding as a policy to secure their aggrandizement. And because of this, he argued that the freedom to breed is intolerable. That he basically thought that the only way that human beings could not overconsume resources was with an authoritarian government that would force us to do the right thing. Now, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, argued that this is a very simplistic understanding of human nature, that we actually can solve many social dilemmas through cooperation, that human beings don't just overconsume and die, that we build institutions to help us manage these common pool resources as a group. And she spent her whole career engaging in empirical research to show that, like, at small scales, when there are conditions of trust and a sense of shared identity, that communities can actually manage public goods and common pool resources without overarching coercion, without the need for an oppressive state, that we actually can recognize that there's going to be a tendency to overconsumption and can find ways to solve this. So we can think of this kind of matrix between excludable and rivalrous goods, right? A goods that is excludable and rivalrous is a private good, right? My own sandwich, my lunch, right? I can exclude you from my private property and it would get used up. Excludable but non-rivalrous goods, you can think of toll goods, literally like a toll road or a utility that you pay for, right? That you have access to. That isn't like used, the internet isn't used up, right? But you still have to pay to get access to it. Those are less interesting than these common pool resources and public goods for political science. So to kind of summarize this idea here, the collective action problem with public goods is free riding, but self-interested individuals are unlikely to contribute to providing the public good since they benefit without bearing the cost. And the solutions are, well, we need a government. This is why we have a government, to provide and coordinate the public good. Right? If we think of the public good of like the national defense, or the public good as public education, right? We need a government to step in and provide and coordinate this public good, to provide public schools, to provide for the national defense, to provide for clean air and water. Now, if we're thinking about common pool resources, things like natural resources, the collective action problem is overconsumption, right? That interested individuals are more likely to overconsume in order to maximize their consumption rather than conserve. And so we can have authoritarian coercion, like Hardin, or we can, as Ostrom suggests, we can try to cultivate a sense of community, that if we have a shared community around these, we can manage these common pool resources or we create fair institutions. We create a decision-making structure to determine how are we going to conserve this resource? Who's going to have access to the timber forest and how much? And how are we going to make those decisions? Oh, we can actually solve this problem by, through a voting system, by having representatives make decisions on our behalf, right? That we're not doomed to either the tragedy of the commons or an authoritarian government. But ultimately, the point here is that politics is how we solve these collective action problems, that we solve these by making authoritative and binding decisions on behalf of the community. So what is politics? The classic definition from the political scientist Harold Laswell is politics is who gets what, when, and how. So we can think about how are common resources divided in a community. Your textbook will define it as the process of gaining and exercising control within a government for the purpose of setting and achieving particular goods, especially the division of resources within a nation, right? That politics is the competition within the government to determine how the resources and other goods in a society are going to be distributed. The political theorist Sheldon Wallen offers a kind of bigger picture that politics for him includes a form of activity centering around the quest for competitive advantages between groups, individuals, and societies. So politics is about competition. B, a form of activity conditioned by the fact that it occurs within change and relative scarcity, right? This is that idea of constrained choices in history, right? That things change and that we don't have everything, right? We have to make tough choices. And C, a form of activity in which the pursuit of advantage produces consequences of such a magnitude that they affect in a significant way the whole society or a substantial portion of it, right? The decisions that we make, the political decisions that we make, the laws that we pass, the people we vote for, have consequences that affect society as a whole. And so we're going to be studying this semester in the context of the United States, how these decisions get made and what types of effects they have. And one last kind of distinction I want to draw here that your textbook will also draw is between government and politics. The government is the means by which a society organizes itself and allocates authority in order to accomplish collective goals. And then public policy are the particular actions, regulatory measures, laws, and funding priorities. This is from a sociologist named Dean Kilpatrick that are made by the government. So we can kind of think of politics as the big overarching concept. Because politics doesn't necessarily have to be a government. A student group has a politics. This classroom has a politics, right? There's going to be decisions that are made that affect the group as a whole. Government is a subset of politics. That how are we going to allocate authority and make decisions on behalf of the society? And one particular aspect of that is making public policy. So that's just kind of layers between politics, government, and public policy. So that's it for this week, this week's mini lectures. Next week, we're going to be turning to this question of power. The two lectures are going to focus on this question of who's actually in charge and how does power work in society. The readings are first from the textbook, the chapter 1, and then this reading from John Gaventa's 1980 book, Power and Powerlessness. On Wednesday, we'll discuss we'll try to talk about power and how power is exercised in American politics, and Friday will be our first current events Friday. So the minute paper question for this week is, and again, you can go to bit.ly/Pauls101MP, and the link is also on the Moodle page, and answer the following minute paper question. Try to think of a collective action problem in today's politics. What type of problem is it? Is it free riding, overconsumption, etc.? And what types of solutions might exist? And don't forget that you can use the minute paper to ask questions about this week's readings and lectures that you want to go over in class in the discussion section. That's it for this mini lecture. I will see you all in the discussion section. Take care.